One of the jobs I would latch on to, which I really enjoyed, was working the Hennepin Patrol. Right here. So this is a Randy Garnhart shot early in my career. That's when I had all of my colors in my hair. My photography began with the Instamatic camera, producing the square photographs. It worked quite well in the beginning because in my railroader's coat, the denim jacket with the brass buttons and the large side pockets, I could squirrel that camera away into one of the side pockets and nobody knew I had it. It was after the crews knew that I learned the job and that the job came first and then the photographs that I didn't get a bunch of flack for being a train nut. In the end, some of the trainers, hey, did you see this or did you see that? No. One such case was we were laying over in Savannah, and one of the hard-nosed brakemen I was a part of a crew with, hey, did you see the 156s at the roundhouse? No, I didn't know it was down there. I had to walk where we were at, from there down to the roundhouse in Savannah. By the time I got there, it had already left, heading out through Iowa. Came that close. That's the closest encounter I had with a 156, the bicentennial engine. You were wondering. Anyway, back to the story. The LAD line included basically from Davis Junction south through Rochelle, Stewart Junction, Mendota down to LAD, Granville Junction, eventually to Oglesby. Mendota, for being out in the middle of Illinois cornfields, was a conjunction of three railroads. The Illinois Central arrived in the early 1850s. The Burlington and the guys of the Chicago and Aurora arrived in the early 1850s. I have conflicting dates as to who was actually there first, the IC or the Q. And then in the early 1800s, or I'm sorry, in the by 1903, the Milwaukee made its presence known, and they all came together right in downtown. Shot from the IC tower at Mendota. And being the IC tower, I'm guessing they were second place since they had to build a tower and man it. Although it was the Q employees that were the operators, so you tell me. The 374 were the long jobs between Freeport and Clinton, Illinois. Mendota's about the halfway point, one of the road jobs coming through. At one time there were multiple diamonds here. BN Coltrane took care of that and reduced it down just to the IC main. The IC coming north, the tower was an Armstrong tower with all the connecting rods there. A northbound 374. Picking up orders, hitting the rear end. And the Q, before it would become the Burlington Northern. Again, shot from the tower. Amtrak became a regular occurrence. This would be the California Zephyr coming east. And it was a conduit for new power coming out of VMD heading for the Western Railroads, as well as the home team. Inside the Mendota Tower, the operator up there, part of the job, the Hennepin Patrol would evolve over the years several times. In '76, at the creation of Conrail, they sold a portion of their track to the Burlington Northern, on which we had trackage rights to begin with. So to get over the Burlington Northern segment, one of our crewmen, and I usually volunteered, had to go down to the acute IC tower to get train orders for that part of the BN. This is a point in time when 367 between Janesville and Ladd would be shortened up from Mendota to Janesville. And that would be shortened up again from Mendota to West Yard. And then it got to the point where we could only run from Mendota up to Davis Junction and return. We would meet the northbound counterpart out of West Yard, South Beloit, who would come down to Davis Junction. We'd swap trains and head back home. So sometimes if we ran out of time, we had to tie the train up north of town. So in this instance, we're the relief crew, and we're waiting for the IC to get some of the switching done so we could get permission to come out. The little outhouse phone booth is connected to the wires that went up and across and over to the IC tower. That was the only way we would connect with them. When the IC operator, Q operator, whoever you're talking to, gave you the clearance, then we would have to hand throw off the derail there, and the tower operator would line up all the other switches. And when we cleared the derail, the rear end crew would have to reset it. Coming across the BN Diamonds, and at this time again we're on the IC's main line. Yeah, that was a little semaphore set up, a dwarf signal, that once governed the Milwaukee trains coming out onto the IC through the interlocking. But again, that derailment put that out of commission, so now it's just basically a stop sign for the Milwaukee movements to don't go any farther than this, because actually it's the end of track. So my first call was for the Oglesby Patrol. This is my first encounter with the 261, which would be a number well known by many Milwaukee Road fans today, but this was the original 261 in the diesel era. This was Tubby Edwards' job. Most of the jobs were named after their regular conductors. Tubby Edwards was a lad man, and at this time the Oglesby Patrol was operating from Mendota to Oglesby and back. At Oglesby, the Milwaukee Road went over top of the IC to go down to the Marquette cement plant. Both the IC and the Milwaukee served Marquette at the same time. This is the old loading dock, and there was a pretty simple way to identify which dock you were supposed to load up at. This was for the trucks, believe it or not. The trucks were, the Milwaukee had the south dock and the IC had the north dock. So when a truck would pull in, they would know which side they would go to load up. And this lasted long after the railroad had been pulled out of there. We report at Mendota for usually a 10:30 call. Sometimes at this point in time in the 1970s, the trains were not big, but we would get our orders and whatnot and report for duty at the Mendota Depot, which at the time had an operator and agent who was all in one guy. and he would handle all of the agency work from Mendota south all the way to Oglesby. Here's a big train with a car of plastics and a coil car waiting to head south. And away we go, heading down through Trek, which was a location for fertilizer dealers. Half of Trek would be served going south, and the other half had to be served going north, the way the the switches lie. This is working the north end, where they both times they primarily received fertilizers. The north or the east side of the facility would get covered hoppers of granular, whereas the south side would get liquid chemicals. Through Peterstown, which is nothing more than an abandoned elevator at this point. Fitchmore, which would be the next station, which had a much bigger grain operation, but by the 1970s, these were pretty much out of service. And with this location being so close to the Illinois River, a lot of it went down for the barge traffic. This was a job that died for time down on the south end, and he's hauling covered hoppers of fertilizer for Trek, and then loads of steel out of the J&L steel mill. This is arriving inland into Ladd. We would come into town. Ladd was famous for its pink mountains. These are slag from the coal mines that were once there. An entrepreneur once had an idea to level off one of the tailings to put a restaurant up there. The problem is the slag, when it would get wet, was just as slick as ice on asphalt, and it never panned out. Here we got on to New York Central trackage. I always enjoyed using their their harp switch stands. Where's I had it right next to my harp here.
Your pointer?
Yeah. Point out my
Where's the pointer?
Well, let's do it this way. The switch stand on the right side had a pin that you had to pull out. Thank you, sir. Quite a pointer, huh?
Is it not focused?
There was a pin you'd pull out, and then rotate the handle 180 degrees, put the pin back in, and away you go. It was just so different from what the Milwaukee Road had. It was a cute little, cute. Sorry about that, guys. It was a handsome idea.
I don't know why it's not pointing.
So, at Ladd, it was quite a conglomeration of 5 railroads in one little burg. Starting on the right, let's change that. Going from Zeering southeast to LaSalle was a Burlington routes line from Zeering to LaSalle. The 3 hash mark line was the New York Central that came from the south, Seatonville Junction, came up, crossed the Q, and continued east to Churchill, where they would interchange with the Northwestern and the LS&BC. The 2 hash mark line coming from Mendota was the Milwaukee, which got on to the New York Central, crossed the Q, got off the New York Central onto their own yard and their own trackage. As operations changed, oh, let me add this. The Northwestern had trackage rights on the New York Central from Churchill into Ladd, and at one time their trackage rights extended on south to Seatonville, where they also had a coal mine. And then when traffic patterns changed, the LS&BC would come to Ladd to do the interchange with all of us. So it was quite a collection of roads out in central Illinois. One of the Milwaukee's reasons down here was for the coal mines, for its own steam locomotives. This is a line that went up to Cherry from Ladd. It was about a 6-mile line. Cherry is famous for its Illinois coal mine disaster, which killed over 200 people. And there's a memorial there for it. This still sits down there at Cherry. At Ladd, at one time this was a division point for the Milwaukee Road back from the Rochelle and Southern days. When we switched to Phillips Joanna Plastics plant, it was we had to work it from the front of our locomotives. So it would cut off anything going into Joanna on the main line while the engines went over to pull the empties. When the engines went over to pull the empties, the rear brakeman would kick off the handbrake, let the car roll by, so then we could work it off the head end. Then go down into Phillips. This is an early producer of plastic film. They would get plastic granulars, and one of their early films was used in videotapes and cassette tapes and recording tapes. Working on a day when he had a Jeep. Northwestern's up in the top there, tied down. Going down to pull an empty. This is on the north side of their building. This is their storage tanks. It would air blow the plastic granules up over the building and into these cars where they would work out instead of silos. Years later, silos were added, and today these are gone. Phillips still remains, but the cars are gone. By the time I got down there, the New York Central had become the Penn Central. Interesting, the Penn Central with the New York Central and the Pennsylvania boxcar together in the same consist. The New York Central, Penn Central would come up to Ladd, and then they would use the Q. They had trackage rights on the Q from Ladd up to Zeri. Working at Ladd off of what would be the southeast Y. LS&BC, they're on the New York Central, Penn Central here, looking towards what was the New York Central and Q interchange tracks. Northwestern in here. Northwestern came in from DeKalb and the Troy Grove line and come down to Ladd. It would be a down one day and back the next. Their track was at points worse than the Milwaukee's Ladd line was. The Milwaukee's Ladd line was basically track in the sod, but it was still good for 25 miles an hour at this point. And the Northwestern apparently put them on the ground pretty good at Troy Grove, so they're gonna detour up the Milwaukee Road. So I'm the conductor pilot on this job, and unfortunately I had to ride back in the way car, as they would call them. And I was taken aback by their bay windows had a roll up and down like you would your car window. And the engineer pilot was on the head end, I was the conductor pilot on the rear end. And by the time we got up to Rochelle, apparently it was one of those days where Rochelle had so much rail traffic, automobile traffic was just snarled. And this was the day when the police department walked into the depot, stop your trains till we can get Rochelle's traffic drained out. How about that? So we were held back at Stewart Junction until we were given a clear signal to come out onto the queue. When we finally got our authority to come out, we ran out, crossed the Northwestern, and at that time there was a connection on the north side of the interlocking there at Rochelle. And so we got up there, we had to back through that connection to get the Northwestern back onto their home rails, and then it was their duty to take it from there. But they would have to run around the train because then they were pointing in the wrong direction to get the train to go east. The queue at LAD. LAD was a junction point where a lot of high wide loads that wouldn't fit through Chicago clearances would come through this way to head west. This was a day I was working 116, 117 between Mendota and Davis Junction. We would go to work at 10:30 p.m. and we'd tie up in the morning. And so on this particular, and I would bunk at Mendota. On this particular day, I stayed up to rail fan the Hennepin job. Coming by the former Milwaukee Road NYC depot at LAD with the Northwestern tied up on the side. Coming off of New York Central trackage. I was able to get 3 of the 5 roads in one shot. The queue happened to have showed up there doing their work, and one of that brush and building. Anyway, you know what? Here it is. This is another shot on that day when the Hennepin Patrol got waylaid and died for time at LAD. At LAD, the crossing was a stop sign affair. And to the right is one of those stop signs, a la New York Central styling. They had stop signs here quite a while. And those are those cast iron things too. This was at one time it was the Penn Central depot, if you want to call it that. Train order office would be a more appropriate answer. By this time, the train order office was closed. You can tell by this mast sticking above the covered wagons that the train order signals are down. We're about to leave the New York Central trackage back onto Milwaukee. That would be a QY connecting between the Q's branch and the New York Central. There's quite a maze of tracks down there. We would usually leave, this is where we'd leave Trek northbound loading. We would leave it in the yard here and pick it up going back. From LAD, we would go on our track to Seatonville Junction. At Seatonville Junction, we got on New York Central trackage. We'd go down to Howe, which would be sometimes would be our next work location, or Depew for another work location. When the Penn Central became the Conrail, the Conrail sold a section of their track. They sold it from Howe up to LAD, which the Burlington Northern purchased. So that's how they got to Howe, and they had an ulterior motive to get down to Depew, but more on that one later. Seatonville Junction was basically a switch out in the weeds. That phone booth would connect us with the Illinois River Bridge, which was a swing bridge and an operator for the Penn Central at this point. Oh, I take that back. This is Burlington Northern, because they put up these big old station signs. So here we would have gotten our train orders at the Mendota Tower. So apparently we had train orders clearing us on down to Howe. Sometimes we'd have to wait for the Penn Central to get by. Burlington Northern got a hold of it. Sometimes we would have meets. We would have a train order wait for whoever at Seatonville Junction, and this would be one of those cases. We were meeting Q's local coming back from Depew, then motoring on down with our coil cars heading for the J&L steel mill. Their track was basically set on cinders, and then as time went by, they would add their white crushed rock to the right of way. Rather smooth ride. Yeah. As the crews became familiar with me, hey, you want to get a shot here, a shot there? Sure. All right. Spot us where you want it. We spot it and I get my shot. Yeah. Sometimes the rolling stock would do the tree trimming. At Seatonville, sorry, take that back. At Howe is where we connected. And on the north side, we went over top of the Rock Island. On the north side was a chemical outfit, fertilizer outfit. On the south side of the Rock Island was Depew. We crossed the Rock Island and there was a connection that took us down to Depew. Sometimes we would have encounters with the Penn Central here at Howe. Sometimes we interchange with them here now instead of Ladd. These are some of the high-wide loadings that wouldn't fit through Chicago clearances. So they would bring them here. These could be scattered between the Q, the Milwaukee, the Northwestern, whoever they decided would be able to handle the dimensions. Sometimes machining was just at the mercy of the weather. One of those high wide loads. It was both wide and had some height to it. Penn Central working over top of the rock, doing their work. They were spotting some more high wide loads. Apparently they were done with them. We would have to take them and then route them up north back to LSRHA to avoid Chicago. This is the Rock Island, coming where we about to come underneath us there. Yeah, that's an entire Rock Island train, and that is IRM's 4506. This was unbeknownst to us. A friend and I were chasing this Rock Island coal train. We were following it east, and I told my friend Randy, I says, I know where they go, I can get us where they go underneath the Penn Central. Unbeknownst to me, a fellow Milwaukee employee and rail fan was lining up the crew to get a shot of it coming over the rock without unaware of our approach. So it turned out that working together, we were able to, voila, get this shot. Yeah, so it was half staged, but yet it was staged unbeknownst to one or the other. So there you go. This is a lead that went down to Depew. I had to take a shot of this because to describe it would not do it justice. And to think that back in the days, the primary reason this was laid in, I don't know how many of you remember a joint train called the Gemini, which ran between the Rock Island and the New York Central. It was a joint operation between Silvis and I want to say it was Elkhart. And that was to bypass Chicago. And they would pool Rock Island and New York Central Power and just run her through. Getting on down into Depew. With Depew, we basically interchanged with the Rock Island. Sometimes, depending on the time of day, between the two engines, you can see the Silver Dome Tavern, which is area renowned for its Mexican food and tacos in particular. So if the crew could time it, we would go there for tacos and then regret riding with each other back home. Sometimes I would just hang out with the power while the rest of the crew went for beans. Done there, we would back out and head across the dry bridge. This is across the where the floodwaters of the Illinois River could back up. I was told at one time during World War II, this would be patrolled by the National Guard. My first few trips over here was I was hanging on to the grips on the seats because I'm not used to looking straight down on the treetops. And I know trains can come off the rails, but few trips I kind of, the fear went away. And to the Illinois River Bridge. This is a swing bridge that was built by the New York Central, operated by the Penn Central. We would get permission, I told you, up at Seatonville Junction to come down this far. When we got this far, there was a set of signals to either cleared us to cross the bridge or not. And the bridge operator would handle those signals as well. Sometimes if we couldn't pass, because we could see boat traffic coming, if I could see boat traffic coming, then I get down off the engines and get a couple other shots that you wouldn't normally be able to get. So this is heading south across the bridge. Train orders are for us. When we crossed the Illinois River Bridge, we came down to, at one time we went on down to Granville Junction. That was where the Milwaukee got off and went east to Oglesby. I believe it was in the early 1970s that the Milwaukee ceased going to Oglesby. But the Milwaukee still had trackage rights south of Granville to McNabb. McNabb is where the New York Central basically made a left-hand turn to head east towards Launceston and Elkhart. So why would the Milwaukee have trackage rights that farther south? Well, I have evidence that the Milwaukee surveyors had plotted out a line from here to Peoria and eventually for the Milwaukee to get to St. Louis. It never panned out for whatever reason, but that was why they had trackage right that went on to McNabb. So coming down from the Illinois River, we got to a place called Marantz. And that's where a Y connection was built to the main line. It was about 3 miles from the Illinois River to Marantz. And we would either back down or head down to the J&L Steel Mill. J&L Steel Mill was quite a large complex. Starting on the right side, we had unloading tracks. There were 2 tracks that would hold 50 coil cars and 2 gantry 2 gantry cranes that could roll the length of the tracks to unload the coiled steel. J&L was primarily a coiled sheet steel processing plant. Although they did some minor steel bar work, it was primarily the coils. They would bring them in for unloading, treating, sizing, packaging for whoever wanted it. In the middle, you have the pickle tracks. Here's where they primarily received chemicals for treating the steel. The final over on the left side was a yard for cars waiting for loading. There were 2 tracks that went inside the loading dock area and a track that paralleled the building. This could hold 30 cars on each track inside there. And what they did was they built crossovers 2/3 and 1/3 the length of the building so you could switch the ends of the tracks without disturbing the rest of the tracks. It was quite a big operation down there. This is where we back down towards J&L. I skinnied up one of these electrical towers before I grew up and knew otherwise. Again, you know, with that Instamatic camera in my pocket, you know, nobody knew. This is an overall view of the unloading tracks and the pickle track. And that's a view across to where the loading track for the empties receiving the new loads. Sometimes we would have to do a dance with the Penn Central down there, or the Conrail, depending on your era. We tried to work together, but, you know, basically it's their railroad, and so, okay, we'll wait till you're done, or whatever. But generally, you know, it wasn't that much of a hassle. Yeah, sometimes those heavy loads might pick a switch, and then you just got a bad day. Because, you know, those ain't coils of toilet paper, I tell you. And once they started to burrow into the ballast, that was it. So here we got clearance to head on back on down to the loading track area, which is primarily where we worked. The unloading tracks, we got into here big time when we got the J&L steel mill trains that came out of Fontana, California. The SP took it to Tucumcari, the Rock Island took it to Kansas City, the Milwaukee brought it the rest of the way. And it would come up to Davis Junction. It would often have a mix of Rock Island, Southern Pacific Power, and Milwaukee Power. They forbid the big SP Power down on the LAD line because of track conditions. So we would just have our 4 Milwaukee Road Jeep covered wagon combination to bring it down. The Milwaukee was in the process of rebuilding the LAD line in anticipation of these trains, but the trains arrived before the rehab was done, and what was once a rather smooth 25-mile-an-hour track in the sod became a 10-mile-an-hour roller coaster. And there was one time it was so bad that twice the steel loads, we detoured on the IC south from Mendota to Lawston, where then we got on the New York Central and came back west to get into Hennepin. The empties went back our way, but it was the... So anyway, we would have 50-car trains, and these tracks would hold 50 coil cars. So on a day, we might have a 51 or 52-car train. We were at the mercy of the Penn Central. Could you maybe just spot those last 2 cars for us? And they would generally take care of us. Oops, that'll do. With the Conrail merger, it became quite a hodgepodge of power down into there. Here they're working they're ducked into the unloading tracks, let us by. Here they're working, they got part of their train stuck on the pickle track and working they would unload these coils. The inbound coils would come in open cars, and they would be unloaded and even spotted right there on the rock. The coils would be. And then the pickers would come out and load them up into a truck to take them into the mill for the processing. Once they were finished, those cars received the covered cars. They wanted the steel protected then. Nice photo op, I thought. So. Sometimes when you're the conductor, you get to call the shots, which I was on sometimes on these jobs. Reading combination there. Sometimes they would leave their power tied up in our way. This would be on the pickle track. Since the Milwaukee had GEs, I was familiar with them. And so we'd come down there, I says, just guide me. Again, conductor has his privileges. I says, you line the switches and I'll move the power out of the way. So we would move it over and then work the pickle track. And then, of course, yep, got to put the power back. Leave it the way you found it. Down on the loading tracks, here's the storage yard. Just a grab shot. That's conductor Swingy was his nickname. He was a conductor on this job. Nice guy to work with. Sometimes we would have to wait for them to clear us to pull the building. It was after I made this shot that I learned that I was lucky I didn't get the camera taken away from me. Yep. Once we got done down there, we would come back up to the Y. There was a phone box here where we would call the bridge operator for clearance to come out. He would either give us a clearance or he would tell us we had to wait for, you name it. And so we would have to stay in the clear. And once that train would clear, we'd call him up once again. Yep, you got clearance to come out. Coming on out. Oh, on the Milwaukee we had leased a bunch of Southern SD-24s. And I was nosing around in one of those SD-24s and I found these flags. I thought, how cool. So I squirreled away with them, and every time I got a chance, I would put the white flags when we were running as an extra. Approaching the bridge from the south end. These were the signals that would govern us whether we could cross the bridge or not. And yes, there was a derail, split rail derail at the signal. So if we didn't have the signal and somebody missed it, we weren't going to cross an open bridge.
Is that division closer?
It would be harder to explain why you went through a split rail derail than how you went off the end of a bridge, I think. But anyway. Back across the Howe Bridge. I learned how to get down in here to do some photography as well. No, I didn't climb down this embankment. And by the time we would get the lad, it was often getting towards the nighttime. We still had some hours to get back to Mendota, so the 116 could have the power back and the train to head up to Davis Junction. These were what we call the bar cars. They weren't tall enough to hold the coil steel, but they could load finished bar steel. These are the coil cars the Milwaukee Road had. With the higher covers, they could handle the coils and also had higher sides. And when I was working the Hennepin Patrol a couple of times, we would get these cars coming up there to the John Deere plant that was in Hennepin. It was cool to see handled cars where I would pick them up, load, and I would spot them to get them unloaded. These were assigned cars. One of the bugaboos about this car, though, was it had 3-section hoods, and you had to pull off the center hood before you could get the 2 end hoods. The crane operators down at the Hennepin Mill did not like these cars because they had to pay attention to what they were doing. So if they could, they would load the 2-hooded coil cars first. Well, the Milwaukee learned of this, so they ordered the new 2-hooded coil cars, but before they arrived, they were still at a disadvantage. So they made a deal to lease Santa Fe 2-hooded coil cars until the Milwaukee's new cars arrived. So then it wasn't such a big hassle of, we got to handle those stupid Milwaukee cars. Now they didn't have anything to bitch about. And then we got the new cars. Kind of cool that we had new equipment coming down to the LAD line. This is the tail end of that same coal train. Sometimes we would get steel from Cleveland in Norfolk and Western cons. These would be coil loads, raw steel, and this would be J&L's competition for the Conrail in Hennepin. And so we kind of kept Conrail somewhat honest with this. If you don't do our bidding, we can always go to the Milwaukee and NNW. These cars would handle bar cars in flat steel. These cars would be assigned to Hennepin. We would get these kind of cars. These are loads of zinc coming into J&L for the steel processing. These are primarily the cars that went to Phillips Joanna, carloads of plastic pellets. And these are again some of the high-wide loads that we would get bypassing Chicago. And this was a biannual affair. The Army would move equipment up to Fort McCoy, Wisconsin, but they didn't always have the clearances to do it. So quite often we would get these coming up from LAD all the way up to Beloit and Janesville and on north to get to Fort McCoy.
It's a real military.
And we also got cars that Penn Central was done with. Generators and structural steel were more high-wide loads that we would have to handle to bypass Chicago. There was one trip, and it was a special trip where we had one of those big Chernobyl split cars with a generator in between them that we would picked up out of LAD. This is early in my career. I was still proving myself. And with 3 officials, including the superintendent, following this train, they were taking care of this with kid gloves. I didn't think it was a good time to be a rail fan. So I can only tell you about that story. But fortunately, our sharp-eyed engineer did spot a broken rail, which we stopped in time for. And they were grateful for that. It was in '79, the Milwaukee Road, winters of '78, '79. The Milwaukee Road put an embargo on the LAD line. And so there was no traffic down that line because of the snow conditions. The IC was still working, but the Milwaukee gave up. At the end of that summer, the Milwaukee went back to work again, but it wouldn't last long. The tower, the IC tower, was in the process of being replaced. all of the throw rods had been severed, and all of the controls of this interlocking went to Galesburg. This is one of the first trains through the automated interlocking. This would be the number 6 California Zephyr. 1979, a barge struck the Illinois River Bridge, knocked it out of line. Penn Central declared they did not have the funds to finance repairs of this bridge and was permanently closed, left open for barge traffic. So that ended the Milwaukee's competition with the Conrail in Hennepin. It also gave Hennepin the monopoly on the J&L steel traffic, and so why would they want to repair the bridge? The bridge was pulled out by the roots in 1986. So today you will not find any trace unless you follow what would have been the right-of-way leading up to it. January 29th, 1980, I went down for a different occasion, but discovered this was going on. It was the day that the IC tower was coming down. It would be also the last day the Milwaukee Road would work out of Mendota. They got their caboose and a car of plastics reporting for work and headed down to Ladd. At Ladd, they did one last drop movement, switched out Phillips Joanna, tie the train together, and leave Ladd for the last time. This would end 75 years of service down to Ladd. Rolling up near Peterstown into Mendota. The IC's LaSalle road switcher was up here to wave goodbye one more time. And once they got the lineup, I asked the crew, and they said, sure, come along. So I elected to ride the last train across the queue there, and see the rubble of the tower. At the north end of the IC trackage rights, once the caboose cleared, Wayne Romanoli is the rear brakeman, and Ray Vollant was the conductor. He's lining the switch back, and he would drive his car up to Davis Junction to pick up the crew because they all lived in Ladd. Rolling through Stewart Junction one last time onto the Q main line, and through Rochelle, picking up derelict Milwaukee Road equipment along the way.
Walmart Farmer Riverside.
At Mendota, then Ellis and BC would pick up the traffic going to Trek, basically the fertilizer plant there. This lasted a couple of years before it went to all trucks. They would leave one of their precious Baldwins out here in the middle of the frozen tundra, but they had an electrical box where they had a block heater in there to keep it from freezing up. The Mendota Depot would fall into private ownership and would go through several ownerships, but primarily financial type institutions, credit unions, and that type of thing. So when I was getting ready to retire from the post office, one of my fellow employees said, what are you gonna do with all your free time? I don't know, maybe I'll write a book. So I did. So I wrote this book, covering it, the Hennepin Patrol is covered in here, as well as all my Milwaukee encounters. It was a short but sweet ride. So, that's it. Thank you for watching.
We'll do a Q&A for a few minutes. Do a Q&A.
So, if you want to pop a few questions, I guess we got a little time, or not. One of the interesting, you noted those N&W gons in there. In the summertime, north of Mendota was a place called, it was south of Roxbury. It's where we crossed the Q's Amboy line. And that was another stop sign affair, where you pulled up, stop. If there's no conflicting traffic, you could go. And the crews would take careful watch of the cornfields, because this was rich in Del Monte sweet corn fields. So being a night job, we would pull up to the stop sign, and the night it was right, it was a Friday night, the conductor brought gunny sacks for all of us. So we pulled up to the stop sign, we doused the headlights, went down to the fields with our bags and our lanterns, came back with full bags of sweet corn, went home that morning and had, a sweet corn festival for the weekend. We got back the next Monday night. Oh, ours is great. The conductor in River Breakham says theirs is terrible. And we come to realize that we had a big cut of those N&W coil cars that put the caboose back into a cow corn field. So, there you go.